I'll do the introduction in Croatian first and then Dobro vam večer i dobrodošli na još jedno predavanje u sklopu našeg projekta Opatija Coffeehouse Debates. Ovo je projekt popularizacije znanosti i demokratske deliberativne kulture, u sklopu kojeg organiziramo različita događanja, što uključuje panel diskusije, predavanja mladih znanstvenika, čitalačke grupe i sl. Veoma mi je drago što mogu najaviti našu današnju gošću, profesoricu Corinnu Mieth sa Rhur University Bochum, koja će nam govoriti o jednoj jako zanimljivoj i relevantnoj temi, Two Phases of Liberalism, Migration between Hope and Crisis. And now to do the introduction very briefly in English, it is my great pleasure to introduce Professor Corinna Mieth from the Rhur University Bochum here in Opatija Coffeehouse Debates. This is the project of popularization of science and deliberative democratic culture. It's been taking place from 2014 in Opatija, and it's my great pleasure to have such a prestigious guest here with us. Also, I would like to thank the County of Primorje and Gorski Kotar and the town of Opatija for their support and funding for this project, as well as the University of Rijeka and Amandia Park Hotels, in whose beautiful venue we are right now. We have a very interesting and very relevant talk, Two Phases of Liberalism, Migration between Hope and Crisis. And without further ado, I would like to give the mic, or maybe not necessarily the mic, but if you needed the mic, anyway, to give the floor to Professor Mieth.
Yeah, thank you, Ivan, for the nice introduction and for having me here. So my talk is the outcome of a year at the Institute of Advanced Studies in Berlin. So it's still work in progress, and that concerns my reflections about migration and stability. And it's also part of a new project that I have in compromise. So, but let's now go directly into the talk. It has the title, Two Phases of Liberalism, Migration between Hope and Crisis. And I will now start with making preliminary remarks. So the first preliminary remark is about crisis. I wrote that talk last year, so it's not up to date to the horrible events that we're facing since 2 weeks, but I kept it the way it is, and then we can later discuss. All right, so I referred it to the so-called refugee crisis that we had in Germany, where I come from, in 2015. So when lots of people, because of the war in Syria, came to my country. And then mass migration into Europe, especially Germany, was linked to the notion of crisis. And that's twofold, because there was a humanitarian crisis in Syria, and that in the first place made people go away from there, because they couldn't stay, obviously, because there was this civil war. But then also, them coming into Europe and into Germany was perceived as a crisis of the receiving country. And that was especially so after around a couple of months when we had, for example, the event of New Year's Eve in Cologne and internal backlashes against migration and the rise of populism and of our German party Alternative für Deutschland, so which didn't even exist before these events. So that's a more internal crisis. And I will, in my talk, concentrate on the latter, so on the backlash of Germany's old population, and do that in the terms of crisis, and to its link of the self-understanding of liberalism. So that's my preliminary remark about crisis. Now comes the preliminary remark about hope. And this so-called refugee crisis that I referred to in Germany in 2015 can also be seen as an example for hope being associated with mass immigration. And that's, on the one hand, the hope of the refugees. So there's statistical data. They were asked so why they came to Europe and why especially they wanted to go to Germany. And it was their hope for protection stability, security, and a better life, and their human lives getting protected. But there was also hope of people in the receiving country, so in my country, for more progressive, more just, morally right immigration politics that found its expression in the so-called welcome culture in autumn 2015. So when people went to the train stations and brought food and said welcome here and so on, so that was also a sign of hope from these welcome culture people of my country that we would get better, opener immigration politics. Now, third preliminary remark about liberalism. Okay, so that's the title of my talk, and I will hold that there's two phases of liberalism, which is the background culture of Western countries like Germany, where I come from. And those two phases, one of them I call national liberalism. So here the perception of migration in 2015 was more in terms of crisis, at least after some times. And the perception from the national liberalists was also that through mass migration there was a threat to liberal democratic stability. I will go into that more deeply later. And they think that closed borders are a protection for liberal values. And on the other hand, but that's also a phase of liberalism, there's cosmopolitan liberalism, and here the perception of migration was in terms of hope. So as I said, the whole welcome culture was thinking, well, but by giving this sign and by doing this, and by being in favor of more open borders, we express cosmopolitan justice. And that's the preliminary remarks, and now we can go right into the talk. It has three parts. The first part is about migration. So how migration is conceptualized in the liberal tradition. In the second part, I will say something about stability. So what threatens liberal democratic stability? And I will go into the differentiation that I already mentioned between external and what I'm concentrating on, internal threats. And then in the third part, I will have a look at the concept of compromise. And I will ask the question, how can compromise help to maintain liberal democratic stability? All right, so that's the structure. And that's the first part, migration. And here in the philosophical debate about migration, it has been famous Joseph Cairns who wrote the famous book, The Ethics of Immigration. And his idea is pretty Kantian. And that's where I spent quite some time on, because I'm not a computer genius. So in the background you see Kant lurking. So that pale figure, it's Immanuel Kant. And he had been the person in the philosophical tradition who gave us the idea that every human being has equal moral worth. So no matter where they come from, and that's also in the background of Joseph Cairns' book. So Cairns' idea is that Western democracies, they do accept moral universalism, so this Kantian idea that every human being has equal moral worth, and they accept human rights, and they consider interstate freedom of movement and equality of opportunity to be important. So that's the values we have internally. And now Cairns asks, yeah, but we're universalists, and then we should apply those values to all people. And then when they, for example, equality of opportunity want to come to our country, then we have no good moral reason to keep them out, because that would mean that we think that our own population, our own citizens, they have more rights, they have a better right to equality of opportunity than anybody who had the bad luck that he was born not as a citizen. So, and that's the moral argument. And then comes the idea that a human right to international freedom of movement, what we internally acknowledge, and equality of opportunity, not within the state, but also for those people who want to enter our state and come to the job market, should be acknowledged, at least by Western democracies, because we have those values. And those values, and I think here Karen's is right, they're always pushing beyond then the geographic borders of Western democracies, because then, as he argues, well, it is not so that every other country is a democracy or even has these values, but once we have those values, we should realize them and apply them at least to the people who want to come to our countries. So that's Karen's. And then we have, on the other hand, but still as a part of liberalism, not cosmopolitan, but national liberalism, David Miller. So he's not in favor of open borders, but closed borders, because national communities have a right to self-determination. And I mean, here he might have some point, because then if you look at it from the other hand, so that, for example, I'll come back and mention this a bit later, but he's in the tradition, liberal tradition of John Stuart Mill here. So that internationally there should be a principle of non-intervention. So we shouldn't go and intervene into any other country and bring them our values, because they have right to self-determination. And then, of course, also we have right to self-determination. And then once we let just anybody in, we might not be able to determine our community ourselves anymore if there's too many other people. So that's like David Miller's argument. And then he goes on to develop why self-determination is so important. And then, for example, it's important because of the protection of the national culture and the self-understanding and the history. So who knows about the history of philosophy a little bit? If we would go back to the 1980s, there was this debate between liberals and communitarians, and here he's kind of communitarian, so that his idea is we have a national community, and what makes this community is their common history and their common tradition and their common values. And that's what they want to determine, whether they can preserve that or whether they want to like give this up. And that's what they have to decide. So think of something like Ireland. When you go to Ireland, you will find any sign when you arrive at the airport in English language, but also in the original Irish language, because they want to protect our culture, although nobody like speaks this original language generally, but they want to like protect this, and it's their decision. And that's kind of like self-determination and preservation of culture and history. And what Miller says is that states are likely to function most effectively when they embrace just a single national community. But that's kind of a different thesis. It's not that they have the right to preserve their culture, but now we get a stability argument that they function the best if they just have a single national community. Because here he would say, well, look, human rights, it's kind of negative rights, life, liberty, security, but it's also positive rights. For example, the right to healthcare. And positive rights, they cost. So you have to raise taxes, you have to provide money, you have to provide health insurance for the people. And then he says that is most likely to function if it's a homogeneous community, because they're more ready to pay taxes and to spend money for their kind of people than for other kind of people. So that's like his stability argument. And he says, well, once things cost money, people are more ready to pay when they're a national community and when it's their compatriots and not other people. they spend the money for it. But it's just what he claims. So he makes like several kinds of arguments for closed borders. Then he has this other book, Strangers in Our Midst. So where he says that nation states produce solidarity among compatriots, and that cultural homogeneity and interpersonal trust are so important to preserve those positive human rights like the right to healthcare or social security. And then his idea is that the public institutions presuppose this interpersonal trust, and this might be endangered by immigration. So here he says, so the functioning of a liberal democracy might be endangered by migration because of these arguments, because we're more ready to do something for compatriots than for people who we don't know. And that's then what I already mentioned, this idea that the social human rights can only be fulfilled within a society if there is a right to exclude. And I mean, there's this cultural argument and interpersonal trust argument, but then of course, so on a wider scale, there might also be an economical argument, because then if you have more people who have to get, for example, social security and healthcare, then are able to pay taxes. So at that point, the system might not function, and then you wouldn't even need this interpersonal trust, cultural trust argument that he brings forward, and that is empirically totally contested. So other people would say it's just empirically not true. All right, but I'm just presenting it, can't go into it too deep here, but what he says is that we still should show some humanitarian solidarity with refugees. So he's against general open borders, that everybody can just come, like Karen's idea is, but he says, so with refugees we should show some solidarity, because they couldn't stay where they were. That's not voluntary, but forced migration, and here we should be kind of generous. All right, so as you could have guessed, there are some tensions between those two positions, between liberal cosmopolitanism and liberal nationalism, and it's this cosmopolitan solidarity with all human beings, and then of course all people who want to come in cosmopolitanism, because once they want to come to different countries, they will have a reason, that is assumed. And national liberalism that puts that in the first place the national solidarity, as I explained to you with David Miller. And then of course there's also tension between liberal cosmopolitan justice, so every human being has the equal worth, and liberal national bounded justice, so yes, everybody might have equal moral worth, but compatriots, they have we have special duties towards compatriots. So towards them, we must secure some social system, but towards all others who are not compatriots, we must not be hostile against them or anything, but we don't have to provide any goods for them, unless they're refugees. Okay, so now something about reasonable hope in the liberal tradition that might be an important background for what Karen is saying. And that is, so Karen stands in that Kantian, but also Rawlsian tradition. So both have the idea that every human being has equal moral worth, and then Rawls applied this within one society and said we have then to have equality of opportunity within the society. And Rawls has this idea that morally we have equal worth, but empirically we're pretty different, so we have different talents, but the different talents we have, they shouldn't be as decisive as they are in radical liberalism, and it's not our fault if we don't have many talents, or if the talents we have, they're not highly paid, and therefore for Rawls it's always about within a society about the worst off, so that their situation gets maximized. So that's the duty within society. And Karen says, well, we have to push that beyond. our society. But Rawls didn't go so far himself, because he said, well, look, but there's not only, he says that in his book, The Law of Peoples, there's not only liberal democracies in our world, there's a lot of other countries, and now we can only have a reasonable hope that those other countries, they will also become democracies, they will also have social systems, and therefore, so once that would happen, no one would have to go from one country to another country for humanitarian reasons. So they would only have to change their country because they like the other country more. And then we would have this Joseph Carrot's world, because then we could have open borders. And that's what we see in Europe, so where we have Schengen. So that you can really go from one country to another without any problem, because they have like more or less the same standard of living. And you don't have to go to that other country because you have to flee, or because in your country you have like no chance to get a decent job and all of this. So, and therefore this reasonable hope, I think, is very important in the background of the whole current thing. And then, as I already mentioned, in the context of David Miller, we have John Stuart Mill, who has said that people have to fight for their own freedom, and is defending the non-intervention principle. So not all the way down, we can discuss this later, but his idea is that we can't bring democracy to other places. The people have to like want this themselves. We can't like force people to democratize. And then Kant had the idea of a kind of teleology in history, so that history has a hidden aim, and the hidden aim of history is very interesting. It comes through commerce. So we start to like make deals and make exchange for money and for trade with other countries that are not democracies, and that will help to fulfill the aim of history to democratize these other countries. And that also he formulates in terms of hope. So behind all this liberal tradition and its dealing with migration is, of course, the hope that at some point people will not have to leave their country because of war, or because they're oppressed or politically persecuted or anything like that. Okay, so now comes Thomas Cristiano. And Thomas Cristiano, he kind of brings together aspects from both sides, so from closed borders and open borders, because his idea is that you can be cosmopolitan but defend immigration restrictions at the same time. And now, how come? So I just quote from him. He says that a morally cosmopolitan view asserts that the fundamental norms of justice that ground the legitimacy and justice of the political communities of modern states are ones that hold for the whole world community. So that's his idea. The initial impulse of cosmopolitans is to assert that political societies do not have a right to limit immigration into political communities, and I think that's exactly what I explained, so from the background of Kant and the equal moral world through Karen. So that's the cosmopolitan idea. But the liberal democratic states represents an essential achievement in the attempts of human beings to realize justice and the common good among themselves. The modern democratic state embodies the best hope, again, we have of ultimately bringing justice to the whole humanity. So he says, the fact that we already have these democracies is something valuable because it shows that we can have this reasonable hope to make all states in a way that people don't have to run away from them. And now here comes his stability argument. He says, to the extent that it is necessary to this development, we must protect such states, so the liberal democracies, from forces that would undermine their democratic character and the normal functioning of their political systems. Immigration policy should therefore, in part, be evaluated in terms of whether it undermines the existence and normal practices of liberal democratic states. To the extent that open borders would undermine the existence or normal functioning of liberal democratic states, such a policy should be rejected from a cosmopolitan standpoint. Yeah, so I think it speaks for itself, otherwise we can later discuss it again. So here you have, from cosmopolitan view, an argument to restrict immigration if it destabilizes those democracies we have in the world, and that are the best hope that people don't have to run away from their country. Okay, so now we're already at liberal democratic stability, and the question is, why does it matter? Cristiano already gave us a reason why it matters, so that it maintains liberal values. But that's also true from the standpoint of liberal nationalism. So you see we have an overlap here. And it's promoting cosmopolitan justice, so from the standpoint of liberal cosmopolitanism. So it's both true that we need liberal democratic stability. And so if you ask those who are also concerned, most refugees say that they came because of stable political circumstances and human rights protection. So just a little story, when I was in South America for the first time, so around 15 years ago, I was talking to a colleague, and then she said, best time in my life I had in Berlin. And I said, yeah, it's a great city and so on. She said, yeah, all this is true, but also my daughter could go to school by bus. And we didn't have to have fear that she got abducted. And that's like the thing from the standpoint of a lot of people who live in not so secure countries, that they say, we want stability, so we can feel safe. Okay, so how can we stand this liberal democratic stability, which is obviously important for like internal perception and also from the outside for the refugees? One possibility is to understand liberal democratic stability as a national community that has cultural homogeneity, and that's of course the David Miller way to understand it. So stability comes from this cultural homogeneity. But once we go that road, the problem is that it's of course excluding, because then everybody who has not grown up in the Commonwealth, so Miller is from Commonwealth from UK, so obviously he's a threat to this stability, and why should this be the case? So I would guess that homogeneity is not the only way to produce social trust. I mean, why shouldn't, and we see that, for example, in the US. So I have relatives who came to the US one generation before mine, and they're like the cliche of being more American than the Americans themselves. So and obviously they're not homogeneous, they were from Germany, and they didn't share this history and whatever, but they totally over-identified with those values, and you can very often see that. So that people come to a new country and then even more like in favor of the values there than people who have been there for a long time. So I think it's just not true what Miller says. And I already mentioned that it's also by other people empirically highly contested. Therefore, I would go possibility 2, and I call this democratic cohesion. And here comes second part of my talk, so about stability. Terence himself, he says that in order for the public order to provide a principled justification for restrictions on immigration, so like Cristiano, he thinks it's possible to restrict immigration, the threats to public order must arise directly from the numbers of immigrants, not from the backlash, that is the violent or antagonistic behavior of the current population towards the newcomers. So he accepts that it's in principle possible. That stability in democratic countries is endangered by immigration, but he says in one case it can come by a very, very super high number of immigrants, and in other case it can come from backlash of the population that is already there, like we witnessed in 2015 in Germany by rise of Alternative for Deutschland, and they said we want no more immigrants. So, and that's backlash from the own population. Okay, he calls it violent and antagonistic behavior of the current population toward the newcomers. And then Cairns goes on, in the latter case, it is the current members, not the immigrants, who are posing the threat to public order, at least from the perspectives of justice. And that's, of course, then cosmopolitan justice. This might not settle the question of what policy to pursue, given the range of feasible options, but it would preclude using public order as a deep justification for restrictions on immigration. And I will go a bit deeper into this now. So I will concentrate, as I announced, on these internal backlashes as threats to stability, and not what lots and lots of other theorists have done, so whether immigrants themselves and by different culture or whatever can be threats. So just the backlash of the own population now. So what Karen says is that this destabilizing, so populism and rise of a very right-wing party, it's unjustified, because then obviously they don't want any immigrants, they just want like their country to themselves, and all the discussions we had here. So from Karen's view, it's unjustified. But it's still endangering liberal democratic stability, although it's unjustified. And that liberal democratic stability is a precondition for humanitarian solidarity and cosmopolitan justice. So we have a problem here. If we are cosmopolitans and want to realize this idea, we can't just enforce it upon those people who were voting after 15 and 20, or even in some parts of Germany 30% for this right-wing party. So we can't simply make them change their mind. We can't enforce that. So we have that stability problem. So how to deal with that backlash? Cairns then, in 2020, was reconsidering 2015 in an interview that he gave when he reflected over 2015. And he's saying something that might be very astonishing. So he says, now, however, I have had second thoughts about my praise for the policies pursued by Germany. Merkel's decision seems to have led, at least in part, to the rise of a right-wing party in Germany, which is deeply hostile to migrants. If that party gains power, then we can say that from a theoretical perspective that is concerned with choosing the morally best policy among feasible alternatives, Merkel made an ethical error in opening the door so wide to refugees, because this is ultimately going to lead to a situation in which fewer refugees get protection than would have been the case if she had been more cautious. And here you see again this argument from cosmopolitanism, that in order to realize cosmopolitanism, we need democratic stability, and then once something destabilizes the democracies we have, and that's not all of the world, as we now know even better than before, then we should be cautious, as Gerard himself says. Okay, so I come now to liberal democratic stability and cohesion. Liberal democratic stability is usually connected to something like social cohesion. I quote from Berger Schmidt, for example, the strength of social relationship, values, and communities of interpretations, feelings of a common identity and a sense of belonging to the same community, trust among social members, as well as the extent of inequality and disparities. So within different groups, national, cultural, and social. However, if social cohesion within groups becomes stronger than within the state, liberal democratic stability is also endangered. So imagine now, and that's the problem with all the history stuff, you don't have a really homogeneous group, but you have a state with different groups, but that live there for a long time, but now they identify as different groups, and their cohesion within the group is bigger than the cohesion with democratic principles and with the states. Then you don't have any cohesion within democratic values within the state. And then that's a German book, The State as Prey, so some lawyer has written this. And then it's like, maybe one example could be Lebanon, so they have different religious and ethnical groups, and then they have to have each one in the government represented, and then they have a turning system. But then when one party gets power, then they give all the posts and all the money to their group. And then when the next comes to power, they give it to their group. And so you never have democratic stability, what would mean that primarily they all identify with the democratic principles. That's also a Rawlsian liberal idea. And secondarily, you have your cultural identity and your what Rawls calls comprehensive doctrine. Primarily, you identify with those democratic values. Otherwise, we don't have liberal democratic stability. We might have different stability, but not liberal democratic. That means that those values prevail, and therefore social cohesion within groups is no solution for what I'm looking for. It can be even problematic. So all the stuff that Miller is arguing with, so this homogeneity, it's stronger, of course, within one group than within the whole state, and that might, in this sense, even be a problem. All right, so still I think that liberal democratic stability implies something like democratic cohesion, so not cohesion with your group, but with democracy. And I interpret that as a shared understanding of values and standards of legitimacy that underlie the liberal democracy. And this is close to what Jürgen Habermas and my colleague in Berlin, Jan Werner Müller, called constitutional patriotism. What is an interesting expression, because patriotism belongs to the realm of David Miller, of course. So you're national, you're patriot towards your country. But then this notion of patriotism should be transferred to the Constitution. And then if you're patriot of the Constitution, then the value of the Constitution, for example, that all people, like in the German Constitution, have equal dignity and equal moral worth, is stronger than the notion that they don't belong to this and that community and so on. So that would be constitutional patriotism. That you're like more patriot, for example, in Germany, to the post-war constitution that has this human dignity paragraph, then patriot to Germany's tradition going back to whenever and having had very problematic consequences for the understanding of being German, as you know, in history. Okay, so the advantage with this like constitutional patriotism, or what I call democratic cohesion, is that it does not presuppose cultural homogeneity. However, its relation to politics and conflicts is quite open. So the question is how to bring about or maintain democratic cohesion when we're faced with political disputes within liberalism. And here my idea is to refer to the concept of compromise, and that's already the last part of my presentation. So why compromise? Why not simply vote if there's political disagreement? So we could say Brexit, we vote. And then it's like a slight majority, let's say 51 is pro and 49 is against. And then we have decided it. So it's Brexit. And even Rawls proposes that we can apply majority rule. But the problem that I see here is the winner takes it all attitude. So then you say, well, I have 51% and now I do this thing all the way down, no matter what the other 49% want. And that, of course, is not going into the direction of the cohesion of a society. And therefore it's problematic, and maybe the concept of compromise is better. So, I don't know how many political philosophers are here, but when they're here, I can't avoid to talk about Rawls, because then every Rawlsian would say, but you don't need this compromise stuff. We have this concept of so-called overlapping consensus. So in a democracy, in order for it to be a real democracy, a liberal democracy, we have to have shared values. And that he calls overlapping consensus of like the idea that we should all have equal rights, and that can be sustained from all what he calls reasonable doctrines that we find in a democracy. And then this overlapping consensus guarantees us stabilities. But I'm not sure whether we really have this overlapping consensus. And then the question is, once we have it, it's super. But once we don't have it, we have a problem. And I think that nowadays, my analysis is that we have a problem. So it's not that I'm criticizing Rawls that overlapping consensus is not good. It's just that I go one step forward, or you can also say one step back, that I'm asking, if we don't have this consensus, what can we do? And here, I think the non-ideal model of modus vivendi, so live and let live, it's a solution if you can't find overlapping consensus. And modus vivendi, live and let live, it's very close to compromise, because compromise is also something where you can't get what you want all the way down. Although you might think that you want the right thing, and the person you compromise with should just accept your position if she were reasonable. But she's not in reality. So she says, sorry, but you're not understanding me. I also have like my interests, and we have to like meet in the middle. And then you can't just get your best option. Okay, and sometimes you have to do that if there is no overlapping consensus. Yeah, so usually compromise is made for the sake of peace at the expense of justice. So that's why this modus vivendi model, live and let live, is like the core concept for compromise. But the good thing of compromises, I think, is that we might reach cohesion via compromise by representing both sides. So if I'm an overlapping consensus defender and you don't agree with me, I can only say to you that you're not reasonable. You have to come here. We can't meet halfway because you're unreasonable and I'm reasonable, and therefore you have to give up and come here. So when I compromise, we're not talking like this, but I say, look, I have this interest, what interest do you have? And then you say, and then we try to find a solution. But then I have somehow to give up my idea of justice, because I was pretty sure that I was right, but then we can't get along, and therefore I have to partly renounce on pulling you on my side and getting my idea of justice through. Now, beautiful quotation from Avishai Margalit, who wrote a book on compromise, and he says, the concept of compromise, I believe, should take center stage in micro-morality, dealing with individuals' interactions, as well as in macro-morality, dealing with political units. And I think for dealing with individuals' interactions, it's quite clear that lots of us would agree that it should. I mean, it's so hard to live together with people who are always standing on principle and they're always right and they never compromise. I think in micro-morality it's clear, but in macro-morality it's problematic because then we also adore people, like politicians, who say, here's my red line. I don't compromise on certain things. So we also adore that. Margalit goes on, after all, we very rarely attain what is first on our list of priorities, either as individuals or as collectives. We are forced by circumstances to settle for much less than we aspire to. We compromise. We should, I believe, be judged by our compromises more than by our ideals and norms. Ideals may tell us something important about what we would like to be, but compromises tell us who we are. All right, so there's other literature about compromise, which is very interesting. It's from Amy Gutman and Dennis Thompson. So Amy Gutman, meanwhile, representing Americans in Berlin. And they have a very good book about compromise. They say, in general, compromise is an agreement in which all sides sacrifice something in order to improve on the status quo from that perspective, and in which the sacrifices are at least partly determined by the other side's will. The sacrifice typically involves trimming your principles, but both can improve the status quo, and that's why they compromise. And now they differ between two kinds of mindsets. They say uncompromising mindsets holds a cluster of attitudes and arguments that encourage standing on principle and mistrusting opponents. So that person doesn't want to move. Whereas compromising mindset favors adapting one's principles and respecting the opponent. And I think you can't compromise without respecting the opponent. So it's not possible, and that's what they build into the compromising mindset that they favor. Okay, I think alternatives we don't need at the moment, but compromise and stability we need. So consensus about procedures, I think, makes compromise more stable. And that's the constitutional consensus, of course. So if you have a certain border lines, red lines, as you say, within that, we have to meet halfway. But we can't leave these red lines that we circled. So, and of course, consensus about justice would make compromise more stable. But so. That's a bit of my point that I say both of the positions that I presented today, they're both still liberal. They're both still liberal. And therefore, maybe within liberalism they could compromise, and maybe illiberal positions they could circle out. And modus vivendi is a compromise for the sake of peace at the expense of justice. That's less stable because it's not a shared notion of justice. And it's more dependent on power relations, but maybe better than to give up on cohesion and to destabilize the society. So, as Gutman and Thompson say, systematic rejection of compromise is a problem for any democracy because it biases the political process in favor of the status quo. So, if you don't compromise, you can't move on, and stands in the way of desirable change. That goes, of course, then, if you take my example of cosmopolitan liberalism and national liberalism, it goes to both addresses. So both should be ready to compromise. Okay, so here I have made a little picture. If we have this constitutional consensus, that's the red line, then we have a lot of democratic compromises inside. So even if we don't get our maximum position when we are cosmopolitans all the way down, we could still, with the with the national liberalists, make democratic compromises because they're still within this constitutional consensus. But then there's other people, they're outside the constitutional consensus, and that's of course the problem then of populism, racist people, and all of this. But with them, we can still make modus vivendi compromise if that is, as in the Karen's quote from 2020, stabilizing the democracy. Now, empirical question would be, and I'm looking forward to discussion whether that would even be the case, or whether, and that's the last line, outside of which are rotten compromise. And rotten compromise for Margalit, it's that a compromise you should never make, not even for the sake of peace. And that's, we can discuss later. So his best example, the Munich Agreement from 1938. You might all know what that is. And there he analyzes this example and says this compromise should not have been made because even at the time one could have known that Hitler is someone who's expensive politics and he should have been stopped there, even though the idea was of Chamberlain at the time, of course, to prevent war, which was very, very good reason to compromise, but then in the end of the day, Margalit says it was rotten compromise, it didn't help, and it shouldn't have been made. All right, so, but I think here in my example, it's not as problematic as my colleagues from those camps might see it, because I think cosmopolitan liberalism and national liberalism, they can, of course, compromise on open versus closed borders. So we could focus cosmopolitan solidarity on refugees in a narrow sense at the expense of liberal cosmopolitanism at the moment, in order to achieve more and better opportunities for them to stay or get protection in the country at the expense of maintaining cultural homogeneity from liberal nationalism. And for example, so I said I wrote that last year we could have taken in all the local staff and women from Afghanistan and not send anyone back who's proven to support liberalism. And of course, and I think I'm running out of time, so for today, at least at the moment, this seems to happen in my country. So, and this seems also to happen in Europe, so that the countries who were very, very skeptical towards refugees, that they now, for a very super sad reason, say, no, but when such big humanitarian crisis takes place, then we're absolutely ready to compromise on our principles and do the right thing in that respect. Okay, so we'll leave it at that, and thanks for listening, and hopefully for helpful comments.
Thank you very much for your excellent talk. So now we have half an hour, maybe a little bit more for discussion. We usually start with one or maybe two questions by the designated discussant. In this case, this is Elvio Baccarini from Philosophy Department at the University of Rijeka. And after that, we will give the mic to the audience so you can ask your questions, comments, and so on. And of course, those watching us on live stream, you are free to type in your questions in the comment section. I'm going to read them and then we are going to discuss them as well. So, Professor Baccarini.
Thank you, Ivan, and thank you very much, Corinna, for your excellent talk, very inspiring. But I would like first to say maybe we can reverse the habit in the sense that if there is someone eager in the audience to ask some question, that would be good maybe instead
of course,
starting with me.
If there are any questions, we can start. We can keep it just like a non-formal discussion, so if anyone has a question or a comment or would like to maybe some clarification or something like that, feel free to raise your hand.
Okay, so apparently it's still better to use the usual form, and frequently there are reasons why some form is usual, that it's already proved to be the best. So I'll try to suggest and maybe also to add something that Corinna said, but for the sake of continuing a discussion with Corinna. So I would like to start with a distinction that appears to me helpful when we speak about compromise. So basically, recently we had as our Erasmus guest a colleague from Pavia, Federica Liveriero, who writes on compromise. So basically half of her upcoming book is on compromise, and here we discussed about compromise. So in a sense, it's a continuation for us also to discuss about that occasion. And the concepts for which I think it could be helpful to start come from a famous American political philosopher that you obviously know very well, but also people in the audience, I think at least some of them know because he has been also guest here. It's David Estlund, who has this, in my view, very, very useful conceptual distinction between aspirational justice and concessive justice. So what is aspirational justice? David Estlund says we can think about justice in the way of thinking what is the fully accomplished justice. So what's the justice that we would realize if we had sufficiently good conditions or sufficiently strong power to realize that justice. So we can think about the perfect justice. And it is aspirational exactly because we know that we can't realize now. So the real world in some sense is not totally friendly to the conception of justice that we think is the best. So this is one possibility for the philosopher to think about the best justice or the fully accomplished justice. This is called aspirational justice. And for some philosophers, this is all that they do. Okay, like for example, John Rawls that you mentioned is the hero of aspirational justice. Then, however, there are other philosophers who say, okay, but what's really the usefulness of thinking about justice that we know we can't realize? So whatever is the answer, and Estlund has some answers, I think that there are some answers. These other philosophers say we must have a real world justice. So think about where we are and try to do the best that we can starting from the here and now. So what seems to me that frequently in the discussions about compromise, perhaps it would be helpful to introduce this distinction to clarify what we are speaking about. So, for example, if we criticize Rawls, it's one thing that if we criticize him in the context of discussion that he is developing. So, one thing is to criticize Rawls, taking in consideration that he's speaking about aspirational justice. And then the discussion is one thing. Or the question could be what we want of justice to implement it in the real world where we are. So if we speak of aspirational justice, in my view, the space of compromise is very restricted. And here it seems that Rawls is right when he says, okay, in a context very favorable to justice, where things are going pretty well, where people are already, let's say, reasonable, which means they all endorse basic principles of justice, they have respect of other persons on the basis of reciprocity, and so on and so on. All the eligible decisions will be sufficiently good that nobody could be damaged or insulted by a single decision. And in such a situation, it really appears that voting is just the sufficient procedure. So let's think that we decide about what we will have to do this evening. And we all love culture and art. And the discussion is whether we go to an art cinema to watch an art movie, or we will go to theater to go to see a drama by Chekhov, let's say. And okay, we can discuss about one or that, but we know that both decisions will be good for each of us. And in this sense, at least both are sufficiently good or acceptable. And in this sense, in such a community, it would be a good decision simply to vote. And also because there is respect between us, and if there is a group of us who love culture and art in general, but prefer theater to cinema, there will be also this sense of respecting the others and not outvoting them all the time. Because Rawls also in one space indicates what are the political virtues. And he says reasonableness, compromise, and half-meeting. And I think there is also a fourth, but I can't remember at the moment. The situation is different in the real world. And if Rawls or a Rawlsian wanted merely to apply Rawls' view to the real world, we would enter in trouble. Because in the real world, we have very different people, and we have people who love culture. To come back outside the political domain, let's say, to the example I was explaining earlier, we have people who love culture, we have people who love art in general, people who prefer theater, others who prefer cinema, but nevertheless they are a community where they respect each other and the common interests are sufficiently common. In the real world, however, we can have people who love culture, people who love football, people who love doing nothing but drinking beer and becoming drunk, and so on and so on. In such a situation, it would be more difficult to resolve questions simply by voting. And then the question becomes, what is the proper solution? So one answer could be compromise. However, the possible worry that I see is that the situations for rotten compromise would be too frequent if we speak about the real world. In the sense that the differences are such that if we want to compromise with the real people in the real world, then we have to compromise also to rather radical people, to angry people, to people furious in general, for example, for their social existential problems, socio-economic problems, I mean existential problems deriving from their social conditions, and then angry, and then they hate because of this, and so on. We have to compromise also with them. The question is where we would stop. So I think that the proper answer is again to go back to the domain where aspirational justice is helpful. So a good compromise is still a compromise in some sense related or at least close to what aspirational justice indicates as what is legitimate. But if we really want compromise in real life, we will have to step outside this. And then the problem is, where do we have to do this? Where we have to stop? And here I think that it could be very helpful again to think in terms of aspirational concessive justice. In the sense that we could say, okay, in the real life, we could have even very bad compromises. If life requires this, if stability requires this, if peace requires this, if we could not achieve anything better by insisting by better proposals. The important thing, however, is to establish that this is a compromise for mere pragmatical reasons, but still to affirm it's not a compromise of justice. So in this sense, I think that perhaps we have a conceptual scheme that helps us in saying at the same time what is real just, what is some compromise with just, and what is stepping outside of just. And that, however, we must have the possibility also to step outside of justice if this is needed for real life in order to avoid some seriously dramatic and very bad consequences. So, basically the question is what do you think about this?
Yes, no, I totally agree. Because in the picture I tried to show, I think I have like quite similar possibilities that you mentioned. But I didn't have aspirational justice, but this constitutional consensus. So that's a bit less theoretical and more kind of factual. But of course, so the constitutional consensus should be one that is backed up by aspirational justice, so in your picture. So that, for example, in the constitution of Germany, as I mentioned in the first article, we have this human dignity paragraph that mentions the equal moral worth of all persons, and that would also, of course, be a part of aspirational justice, because in the world it's not like this, but that's what the Constitution says, and that what lies within the Constitution I call like democratic compromises, and then you have still lots and lots of leeway, I think, and depending then on how the power relations are, you will get different outcomes, of course. But I think the important thing is, and therefore, so I didn't, of course, want to answer the question on the level of aspirational justice or within ideal theory, or what's the roles question, the best way to live together. I focus on a very non-ideal world that is confronted with mass migration, sadly, because people have to leave their countries, and it's even worse this time than it was back in 2015. And now the question is how to deal with it. And then, so my, I think, primary message was that it's not a moral question, it's a political question. And then once you identify, like I do myself, as a cosmopolitan on the moral level, then it's already difficult to discuss with the people from the David Miller camp, because you wouldn't say, but you should be more open or whatever, and then you think you're in the moral right position, but maybe, and that was why I developed this talk, maybe on a political level this is not any helpful. And that was the quotations then from Goodwin and Thompson, who said, well, but if we want to move away from the status quo, then maybe we also have a bit to move away from aspirational justice in order to give a bit leeway to the other side that might not be, from our perception, morally right, but they also have to compromise, and once they also compromise, we move them, and they move us, and then something's going on, and maybe that's better to move the status quo a bit, even though if you don't get the thing all the way down, and if you don't. So that was kind of my motivation. But I think it's compatible with what you said, because then also we have this modus vivendi compromise. And that would be, so if you make compromise, and that's what Karen's also mentioned in the two quotations I showed you, well, if people who are outside this constitutional consensus make a lot of pressure, and that's threatening stability, then what are you going to do? And that's a opportunity for a modus vivendi compromise. And then the question is, where does this rotten compromise start? And then for Marganit, it's with cruel and inhumane regime, but it's still interesting question. So when that would be the case in our world. And then I think, so what you also mentioned, so if you have too much ideal theory, then Rhur compromise comes too early. So it takes away the opportunity to still make a lot of modus vivendi compromise and to save peace at the expense of justice. And that might be in our real world very, very important very often. And that's then almost, I think, at the borderline of normative political philosophy, because then the more you go into like the real world and the more you're ready to compromise, the less normative your theory is, of course. And the more normative it is, the less possibilities you have to compromise, because then broken compromise might come very, very early. Or you say it's on totally different levels. So I have my moral principles that say that something is immoral pretty quickly, but in the real world I still have to compromise, and I wouldn't go for my moral principles all the way down. Or that's kind of similar to the tolerance principle. I wouldn't impose what I think is morally right on other people. So one example in roles for reasonable disagreement and in the compromise discussion, so Veronique Zanetti has an article about that, it's discussion about abortion. Because pro-life people, they think it's murder, abortion. And pro-choice people, they think it's not, and not to have the opportunity, it's total unfair restriction of the rights of women. And now how can they ever come together? Because, and then a very interesting example this is for how can they discuss. And then they made experience in the US how those two groups can even discuss, and then they have to accept a meta principle in advance, so that they don't want to convince the other person to come to their side. And then they can talk. So when they agree about, you have your opinion, I have my opinion, and now we have to find a solution. But you don't try then to convince the other party to change their mind, to give up on that. And then you can find a pragmatic solution, like for example in Germany, and that's what Zanetti then points out in her article. That's a kind of legal compromise, so that in Germany it's legal to have it's illegal to have an abortion, but you don't get punished within the first 3 months. So both sides are represented. So it's illegal, that's representing the pro-life, but you don't get punished, that's representing pro-choice. And that's of course how hard then within morality the concept of compromise is, because then you have to come to terms with parties that morally speaking you totally disagree to and you totally reject. But then if you have to live together, then maybe it's necessary to find some kinds of compromises that do represent both sides. Because the other opportunity is only to force those people from the other side to accept your opinion. And that's problematic with this democracy thing. So at least if you assume what Rawls does, that there can be reasonable disagreement on that question. And there might be other questions where you can't have reasonable disagreement. If you have one group that says, well, but everything should belong to us, and we take it by force because we're whatever superior group, or then it's hard to compromise with them without going into rotten, maybe. But then for the sake of peace, maybe you have to. So that's interesting, because Margalit says rotten compromise exists, and it's what you should never do, it's the red line. And then, for example, Fabian Wendt, who has worked a lot on compromise, he says there is no red line. You can always compromise. It's just depending on the circumstances, what is at stake. And you can always find some kind of compromise, unless, and that would be the alternative concepts to compromise, you're stronger. you're just stronger, because then you can enforce your thing on the other party, then you don't have to compromise, you can simply enforce it. Or you convince someone, then you don't have to compromise because the person says, now you explain it, I'm sorry, I'm on your side, I was wrong. So that's also a possibility not to have to compromise, but in lots of occasions, and that's what I commented on that Margaret quote with the micro-morality. Well, we do it all the time, and I think it's good that we do it because otherwise it would be very bad, but on some things we shouldn't do it, and that's also true, and therefore compromise is like contested conception, I think. It may be dangerous for philosopher, political normative philosopher to go there. Yeah, okay.
Excellent. Do we have questions and comments from the audience?
How much would you be willing to sacrifice to have a peace but also a stable compromise?
I mean, that depends. And I think that's why I agree with Elvio that for a normative political philosopher it's difficult to go there, because then if you're like standing too much on principle, then you take away the opportunity from yourself to save peace. But then on the other hand, and I think I would go with Margalit, so where he says what is cruel and inhumane, that we should stand up to, and we shouldn't compromise there. But other things, so like I gave you the example pro-life, pro-choice. So when you're pro-life, you think it's murder, but you have to live together in a society with those people, and then maybe in the first 3 months it's less murder than later, and maybe you can accept that and still condemn them and think they go to hell or something, but you don't shoot them, you know what I mean? And therefore I think that's possible even if you have the morally other opinion, if you then can still like live together with them and think, but they personally will be like kind of unhappy and be punished in afterlife or whatever. And I think cruel and inhumane, I think I don't have to explain what that means. And there is like red line. And Fabian Ben would say, but if there is the choice between cruel and inhumane, and more cruel and inhumane, then you might compromise, well, for the sake of less cruel and inhumane, you see? And there it gets really hard, but I also understand them to say cruel and inhumane is the absolute border, and then you shouldn't do it. And maybe you still do it, but then it can't be justified. I think that's then also discussion that we often have in morality, so between what can be justified and what can be excused. And I would then say it can't be justified. Maybe it can be excused that a person does that, but it can't be justified. If you know it's with cruel and inhumane regime, or it has cruel and inhumane outcome, even on third party, we didn't even speak about like who compromises with whom at the expense of what, and who else is concerned who might not even be part of the compromise. So I would say then it can't be justified. Yes.
Excellent. Any more questions or comments? Yeah.
About the compromise that you mentioned about abortion, I don't consider it fair, because there is always that pressure that you break the law. And it's much easier to change the part about punishment than the part about something being legal or illegal. And if there is some kind of official record that it says that you break the law even if you weren't punished.
Yeah.
You may not get some opportunities professionally because you have to have the clean record and you don't have it. And I don't think there should be some compromises when we talk about some part of freedoms, personal freedoms, because they are always in danger.
Yes.
It's like this fight is always always here. Even when we think that we want something, it's still in danger.
Yeah,
Very
but
safe.
But look, I totally agree with you. So I'm totally on your side. But then, and that's the perspective that I took today. So if we have our moral stance, and I'm all on your side concerning this, but then we have people in the society who don't share this, and who we can't convince, then how do we deal with them? And that was the question. And then if we have to meet them halfway, or the jurists in that case try to represent both sides, then of course we think that how we are represented, because we have like this different moral idea of how that should be resolved and who is right here and who is wrong here. So it's not the optimal solution. And that's never what a compromise is, because compromise by definition is not the optimal solution for neither side, and then of course also not for our side in this case, and therefore, so I was running out of time, but I made myself two objections, and one objection is the justice objection, because then, of course, you give up on the level of compromise, not on the level of your personal moral ideas, on your idea of justice, because then you say, well, okay, I have to meet the others halfway because we can't fight that out with guns, so we have to live in the society together and find a solution, and then you're, of course, partly unhappy with that solution because it doesn't represent your moral idea. And that's totally understandable, the way in which you articulate that, because I think that's how, like, this side that you articulated is represented in that compromise, and that's unjust. So if you assume that you're morally right, yeah, that's the price of compromise.
Do you think your morality could outweigh and gain someone an advantage in a compromise? For example, when we speak about abortion, it is a cruel thing, but if a woman wanted to do it because she found that her child will suffer from a chronic illness that could lead it to have an awful life, and it wouldn't make a fulfilling and happy life, what would be your perspective on that?
I mean, so I think my take is not about the specific examples, so that I take sides in them, although I sometimes do, but to explain what the notion of compromise means. And I think the most important positive thing that we could get from it is what they said, what a compromising mindset is, Kaplan and Thompson, and they said, well, you're ready to trim your principles and to respect the opponent. And I think the most important thing if we want to live together is that we respect each other and that we try to understand why the other side has such worries about, like, that they are so, like, different from what we think is morally right. And then, so until some point, I think you can even agree, so that life is important. And then also women's life is important. And then, so also what is good life, bad life, what is pain, what is, like, maybe you don't want to, like, put on another person, like a fate to bear and all of this. And then maybe you can come to agreements even, So if you try to understand, but at a certain point you might not be able. And then you have to like find a solution how to deal with this that includes as much from the other perspective as is possible. But it's of course never as beautiful as if you can convince the other party that they're wrong and you're right, and never as ugly as that the other party is just as stronger and enforces their view on you without listening to you and without you being able to defend yourself. Yeah, that's what I think.
We have time for one more question. Any volunteers? If not, I'm going to ask.
There's
Okay. Oh, sorry. Yes. Go ahead. Okay.
I'm not so familiar with the theoretical part of all of this, but what comes in for me in mind when I was listening to your presentation, I feel that there is just too much power relation between different parties, and this use of power is not. I see that it's not giving much space for the compromise. So I don't know where is. I don't see the solution here. I would like you to explain a little bit more. For example, you mentioned the example of abortion, and when two sides get a dialogue, which is great, but often there is also using of power from one side to undermine the other's perspective. So this is something, I don't know where is the solution here when one side is using the power and not just not trying to find compromise with something. How to create a dialogue in this situation.
Yeah, so I think it's right what Elvio said, that I would take the whole Habermas thing, so an ideal consensus in this aspirational justice camp. And then the idea was that Habermas idea, that we have an ideal dialogue and that it's not allowed to apply force in that discourse. It's just the argument, and it's an ideal situation where we have to, like in roles, abstract from our power relations. So that I'm the professor, you're the student, or whatever. I have the gun, you don't. So that we have to forget, and then we have ideal discourse, and then the result we get under these circumstances is legitimate because we didn't apply illegitimate means when we started that discussion. And I would totally agree, so that is super good, and that generates legitimacy, and that's all, I mean, that's why he's famous, a perfect system on the ideal level to say, how could we find out what would be just? So if we would discuss in a way where we then get rid of all power relations that then make the outcome that we have representing the power relations only, and not generate a legitimate result that we get by definition when we get rid of power relations. But then my talk was about something very different. My talk was about when we can't have that, what can we do in order to still make some progress? And then I was saying, well, we can try to apply this compromising mindset. And we can try to respect the opponent and in the first place, not judge them, but listen to them what they want. And then we can try to meet them halfway. But then always, and again by definition, we get an outcome that doesn't reflect only my morality, although I might be convinced that I have the right approach. And it also doesn't reflect an ideal situation. And therefore, it doesn't generate legitimacy in the sense that the thought experiments of Rawls and Habermas would. What it might generate is a solution for the problem the two of us had that we can both accept under the given circumstances. And that is why Rawls says that the notion of modus vivendi, how he calls that in the general sense, is unstable. Because once you have more power than me, you will renegotiate and say, under the circumstances we had 2 years ago, that was fine for me, but now I have more power and I want to renegotiate, because now it's not good for me. And then we might, under these new circumstances, get a new result. But then, sometimes, and that was my perspective today, that's all we can do. Because then my saying, but under Habermas conditions, you would act differently, you say, well, but we are not under these conditions. And then, what can we do? Can I then say, but you are irrational, you're immoral, you don't accept all the right things that I come on the table with? Maybe that's not helpful, because maybe if we talk like this, you're offended and say, okay, then we don't talk, and I just impose on you. Or otherwise, if I can just impose, then I might say, I have the right thing here, and now I impose on you, because you have wrong opinion, immoral, and I'm legitimate to do this. And therefore, so that was the borderlines I said, you can convince the other or enforce upon the other, and once you can't, and you still want to find solution, then you compromise. But it's not, and there can be more stable and less stable compromise, I think. And I think it's more stable if it's more we agree upon. So that it's just a kind of conflict of interest. So we have the same values and so on, and then it's just that we have different interests. So also Elvio mentioned that, so pragmatically, go we in holiday here or there, or is it fair that I do the laundry and you do the washing machine or whatever? So that's easy and might be very stable if we agree about like that we should be fair, for example. But then if we don't, all I say is that it's then still better to compromise than not to, unless it gets rotten. Yeah.
Excellent. Thank you so much. I'm very, very grateful for all of you participating in the discussion. Of course, a huge thank you goes to Professor Mieth and for her wonderful talk. It is a great pleasure of mine just to say that a lot of people mentioned in this talk, including Tom Cristiano, including David Miller, also including David Eslund, have been here in Opatija. This is one of the photos. You can see both Tom Cristiano and David Miller.
Yeah, great talking. All in a row. Yeah.
So I'm really grateful that Opatija has this huge opportunity actually to host, of course, thanks to Rijeka and the Faculty of Humanities, but nonetheless that Opatija has this opportunity to host a lot of great philosophers who are actually shaping the contemporary debates on many important issues. So I would like to thank you all for participating in this panel discussion. I would, of course, like to give a huge thank you and a huge applause to Professor Mieth. And finally, I would like just to announce two events we have planned for this and the next week. On Friday in Rhur at 7 p.m. we have a talk, a public lecture by Luca Malatesti. The talk will be about philosophy of psychiatry, and to be more precise, will be how to define psychopathy. A very interesting talk, so we are all invited on Friday in Rhur. And on next Tuesday, 8 days from now, in the headquarters of our association here in Opatija, we will have a presentation talk of the game, the board game Bridge. So we all know and you have heard about Bridge, we'll have a Bridge Club joining us and presenting the game. So these are all events organized within the Opatija Coffeehouse Debates project, which along with scientific lectures and so on, has started from the previous year, promoting also the holistic activities from young activists and so on. So thank you very much for joining us here, and I hope we'll see each other again, some of you in the very near future, for new interesting talks, debates and presentations. Thank you so much.
Yes.
Cristiano, David Miller,
Andrew Williams.
I believe she's smiled from our association. I
Oh,
think you
I
guys
see.
were the most like she was leading it.
Oh, I see. That was the first summer school.
Yeah, that's also the Great. I can go with you right now. Already better. And you know where the restaurant is, right?
Yes.
Okay, you can go. The table is already booked reserved. And I will talk in 10 minutes.
Okay, so we wait you there.
You can wait me there.
We can have a glass of wine.
Exactly.
That's very good.
So,
So see you in Rocco in 10 minutes. What are you doing to say then?
just say, yes.
Or your name?
It's on my name on Zerovac, on my surname. Nonetheless, yes, you can start to take R1 and so on, but we can do it in the very end when I do the
Okay.
so
I just tell it's
persons.
for persons booked the name Ivan Cerovac.
Exactly, that's
And
it.
I must announce that the account will be R1.
Exactly, and that's it.
Perfect.
See you there in 10 minutes. I'm just having to
That's-
bring this up and that's it.
Fantastic.
And not for that. Okay, so this is what something for you. It's basically a bottle of wine from us and some materials from the tourist board of Opatija. Oh, you're welcome.
And our codes,
There we will make some.
okay, so let's follow Ivan.
Maybe, I mean, we can. This is going to be removed, so we can.
Pozdrav.
Okay.
Nisam uspjela ovo riješiti. Ne znam. Može samo onaj online.
Ja sam uvijek opičala reći tajne stvari.
Još ne znam da što se nije instalirao. Sad moram naći.
Za sad ugasi